what's going on, everyone? And welcome to 2024 and the new year of Cinema Crusaders. It is Friday afternoon here in Southern California. It could be Friday evening over there on the East Coast. It could even be late Friday or Saturday, depending on where you are in the world. But no matter where you are, you know it's time for your favorite retro review show, Cinema Crusaders, the show where we look back at movies that are at least 10 years old to give them another look, reintroduce them to a new audience, and give our takes on the movies about what we like about them, what we don't like about them, and why we think you might want to check them out, whether we like them or not, because we don't always agree on the movies, whether we like them or not. But we always think that these works of cinema are the things that we are standing on now. They're the building blocks for what's coming ahead. At least we hope so. We hope people are going back and looking and learning. And there's always stuff to learn from these old movies. And there's plenty of great cinema to enjoy. So that's why we do it here at Cinema Crusaders. But before I introduce the movie that we are going to talk about tonight, I need to introduce those gentlemen who are instrumental in helping me break down these movies and analyze them. I'm talking about none other than my fellow Cinema Crusaders. So first I will introduce a writer, a English professor, and a very good friend. I'm talking about none other than the man, the myth, the legend, Steve Shadewing Sellers. How you doing, Steve?
Doing pretty good, and looking forward to starting off the new year with a classic film. I'll leave you to introduce it, but it is definitely sets a high bar for film in various respects, and it's also a movie that made a bunch of careers, much like Excalibur did, and that is going to be a hint for you as to what you can expect from this movie. So yeah, I'm looking forward to diving into this.
Yeah, you could definitely say that if you're looking for a star-studded cast, it's going to be hard to get more of a star-studded cast than this one. But we'll get to that in just a moment, because I have a feeling that where we talk about the cast portion of the show is going to be quite inflated in this episode. So yeah. Next, I want to get to another great friend, but he is also an incredible creator out there on the indie scene. He does movies. I know he's working on a new movie right now, which looks absolutely fantastic. It's in the planning stages, but he has held all sorts of award-winning short films out there on the circuit right now. Not only that, he is a comic book creator. He is one of the hardest working men I know and one of the most talented men I know. I'm talking about the man behind Warehouse 9 Pro, Lance Lucero. How you doing, Lance?
Hey, that's a heck of an introduction. I should just drop the microphone and leave. Thanks a lot. Well, we're back in black, and I'm excited about discussing this flick. I mean, I had been excited. This is a poignant movie that set precedents probably for the next at least 30 years after it came out. So yeah, talk about like Shade said, setting the bar high. This is a movie that did it.
Awesome. So without further ado, I am going to introduce that movie that we're talking about today. Now let me just give you a brief introduction. In the 1960s and then into the 70s, there were a whole series of movies made about various historical events. Some were made by American companies. Some were made by English companies. They were about a variety of different events in history. But to me, there was we've been on this format that I enjoy quite a bit, where we are taking an actor or actress from the last film and carrying them forward to the new film and going from there. And we started off on an English picture, and we've been in England since then. And I can tell you that we're going to get away from that next time, but that is for the next episode. But we kind of wrap up that whole episode of Cinema Crusaders, that whole era of Cinema Crusaders, with this film. And it was an unplanned sequel to a film from a whole other movie studio called Becket, about the life of Thomas à Becket. But Thomas à Becket is intertwined with Henry II. And in that movie, Henry II was played by Peter O'Toole. Oddly enough, But I think it was 1 or 2 years later, Peter O'Toole will come back to reprise his role as Henry II. But much later in Henry II's life, in the movie we're talking about today, The Lion in Winter. And in The Lion in Winter, he is it's him having Christmas in a castle in England with his estranged wife and his three, I don't think there's much way to put it, psychopathic children. Uh, and it's based on actual history. And it's just a fantastic drama that is riveting. It's one of these movies that doesn't rely on cheap theatrics or gimmicks to get you through it and hold your attention. There's no sex, there's no overt action going on. You are held mesmerized, and I think it's fair to say, and I'm going to throw it out real quick for first thoughts to my fellow Crusaders, but you're mesmerized through this whole film, which has a fairly long running time, by the sheer power and performance of the various actors and actresses in the film. And I'm going to introduce them in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to go around and get some opening thoughts from my fellow Crusaders. So first off, Shagwin, what did you think? What are your initial thoughts on this film?
I think it's really, really good. It's a classic, and for a good reason. Like you, I saw Beckett, and I was pretty much expecting Peter O'Toole, to land Henry II as he had there. That movie was all about the relationship between Henry II and Thomas à Becket, and that kind of sets. If you've seen that, that sets the tone for things.
Yeah.
If you haven't, I would say if you've seen Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, this very much sets the tone. It's a similar tone, because you're dealing with these convoluted and complicated royal relationships within the family dynamic, and how screwed up it is when you have political power involved with family dynamics, and it makes for a mess. And like you said, a lot of these characters are really not good. There is nobody like you can really root for with any of them, but they're also complicated characters, and they're fun to watch, that you're pretty much riveted. And not only that, the writing is very sharp, like very, very witty. You get some really great one-liners out of Katharine Hepburn, out of Peter O'Toole, out of all these great actors, and that just elevates what is already an excellent script when you have actors that are this amazing, pumping out these lines every other second, and just kind of in rapid succession. It's amazing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the fantastic parts about this film, and I'm going to get into the characters in a moment, but we've done some other historical dramas. And Lance is correctly pointing out, as we all, that some of them play kind of fast and loose with the history. Now, this one, we don't know for sure if this is how things went down between the royal family. But in general, we know that their relationships were very similar to the way they were in this film. And so, and what their ultimate goals were, and how they negotiated or squabbled with each other, and wanting to kill each other. I mean, Henry's sons rebelled against him 2 or 3 times, if I remember correctly. So it's a very good film in that way as well. But first, I want to get to Lance on his initial thoughts on this movie.
Well, it's like one of those top-notch, Hollywood productions. I mean, flat out, with the sets, the costumes, the cinematography, how everything is laid out, and how it is somewhat laid out a little bit more theatrically, because it's a lot of people talking. And you nail it when the performers nail it. That's it. It's not boring to watch. It isn't just people flapping their lips. These are trained professionals, and they're there for a reason. And this is the kind of film you roll film on, especially when you have a cast like this. Even though a majority of them are up and comers, but we've always talked about the it factor. We've always talked about the charisma factor, and you can see it in Timothy Dalton, Anthony Hopkins, list goes on. It's like, okay, they had the chops then, and then we see them become the elders decades later, like an O'Toole, like a Katharine Hepburn, and that's what holds this movie together, is the performances, flat out.
Now, that's one of the things that I wanted to bring up, and I was going to bring it up at the end, but I'm going to bring it up right now and go around to both of you real quick. I'm going to start with Lance before I introduce this cast. Now, I'm here saying that this is a star-studded cast, but back in the day, when this movie came out, it was dominated by two actors who were headline performers, Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole coming off of Lawrence of Arabia and several other movies. He was a rising star. He was still a younger man, but his star was on the rise. Katharine Hepburn was a well-established movie star. But the rest of the cast, which included John Castle, Anthony Hopkins, Nigel Terry, Timothy Dalton, Nigel Stock, Jane Merrow, and more, were young. But one of the things we've seen in modern Hollywood is that they keep going to the well to the same actors and actresses instead of bringing in new blood and vetting them. And I'm not going to compare Star Wars to Lion and Winter. I like Star Wars, but it's doesn't hold a candle to it as far as sheer movie making, as far as the overall power of the film. But you look at Star Wars, George Lucas cast 3 unknowns in the main roles. He had Sir Alec Guinness, who was a known factor, and that was it. The rest of them really weren't that well known.
Peter Cushing would be the only other one that was known at the time.
Absolutely. And many other films were like this, where you brought in new blood, and eventually they became the old guard, the established actors. And I don't see that as much today. And I'm curious what you think of that, if you see the same thing. I'm going to go to Lance first.
Oh, I don't see it at all anymore. And if so, some of the old performers are now, to me, very derivative. They're a parody of themselves, like say an Anthony Hopkins. Whereas, he hit his stride early on and kept it going, but then it got to the point where he just is that mentor elder at times. And you bring in some younger people in certain situations, and he's there he's the anchor, to try to hold it all down. But there's a cutoff, I believe. I believe there is a cutoff when you finally say, okay, the old guard doesn't have to be that old. They can be established relatively quick. And I still think that adds substance to commercial ability, which sometimes, they push it too far nowadays. They want to keep going after the same Anthony Hopkins, the same Morgan Freemans. You know what I'm saying? It's like, okay, we've seen them play these parts over and over again. And is it just so that we can introduce somebody new? I don't think it works well today. Back then, maybe it wasn't so thought as a strategic commercial attraction. I think they were just going for who best fit the roles. Mm-hmm. And I think that helped. But also, grabbing people from, alumnus from the Royal Shakespearean Theatre or alumnus from other art schools. There was this kind of passing the torch attitude. I mean, was it going to work? It was always a gamble. Did it end up working in this sense? Absolutely. It's just one of those magical times in history where it all just fell together and everybody advanced. Everybody did something. Everybody was a legend. You don't get that very often.
Yeah, and I think, once again, I don't want to be trite, but you see this in the superhero genre where every time they want to cast a new superhero, they keep going to the same old established actors and actresses. And it's like, look, there's a lot of very young, up-and-coming, hungry, and talented actors and actresses who fit the bill, who look the part. Why not bring them in? And a lot of times they don't. And the latest one, and I'm just going to mention it in passing, is they're casting Sentry. I'm sure you could find a very good-looking guy who fits the bill to play Sentry in the new Marvel movies. Instead, they're going to cast Ryan Gosling, who's already played Ken. And I think that kind of takes away from a whole host of things. So, but that's my 2 cents. We're getting off superheroes. Real quick before I get to Steve, Mike from Omen Comics or Omen Publication says, if modern filmmakers have seen farther than others, it's because they have stood on the shoulders of giants. Exactly.
Absolutely.
That's what it's all about. We're supposed to learn, and I think what Lance said has a lot of relevance as well. Is that I think too many people nowadays are like, I'm going to get as much out of the industry for as long as I can, even if that means I'm taking a leading man role at 85 years old for a character that passed its prime 20 years ago, instead of letting somebody younger take over, So
it makes me respect people like Michael Caine all the more, because Michael Caine decided, I'm noping out of this business. I've said what I have to say. I don't want to play 100-year-old men.
Yeah.
Right.
Not it takes a rare kind of actor who, is able to turn down, and considering all the money probably has been thrown in his face, for him to do that says a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you look at like a Peter O'Toole, who was like in his 30s and playing a 50-year-old guy, in this particular film, I mean, granted, there was a different sense of maturity going back 50, 60 years ago when it comes to males and females. I mean, obviously, he had some mileage on him, and it lended to the role. And sometimes that added bit of charisma could work. And I think in this instance, they really lucked out that it worked. I can buy him as a 50-year-old man, even though he's like 36 years old.
Now, that is a very interesting point, and we're going to get to that when we get to Peter O'Toole, because the two movies, Beckett and Peter O'Toole and Lion and Winter, are a couple years apart at most, and yet the two versions of Henry are supposed to be 30 years apart in age, and you really believe that he is 30 years older in this movie, which is incredible. But Steve, to the point we were on before we get into the cast, because we got quite a few people to talk about. So,
sure. What were you going?
I just wonder if you had any other comments on up and coming young actors being given chances today. So.
They're not unless they like specific roles. Like you can see, like with the Younger Avengers, they are going a little younger, but even then, you're getting people like Haley Stenfield and people like that. So it's not completely new. There definitely are situations where you would think they would bring in somebody else, but it's a lot of this stuff is corporate owned. They're trying to avoid risk, and so they're taking their chances more on well-known, established people. Rather than, trying to take a chance, which this movie takes quite a few chances, because people like Anthony Hopkins were not known quantities at the time. He turned out to be like one of the all-time greats, but at the time, nobody knew that. Yeah. So, a lot of it is like you have these kind of artistically driven movies, that were made before all that happened. And, you're getting results like this.
Absolutely. And I will add something kind of maybe a little off, is that we see the star power today as a result of back then. But really looking at this film, really taking a hard look at it, looking at Anthony Hopkins, as great as he is, I felt he was the weakest link acting-wise in this film. I'm not sure if it was the question of casting in his role, but did I really buy him as that badass general? Did I really buy him, as that hardcore guy? I kind of didn't at times. I think he faltered a couple of times. Maybe it was said he was overwhelmed by the star power that he had to deal with. But hey, you're in the show now. You need to step up to the plate and swing. But there was a couple of moments where I think other performers outshined him. In particular, Timothy Dalton. And that's just my opinion. I mean, great performances all around, but I just bought what Dalton was doing, and when they were actually going toe to toe, I think Dalton had the edge.
Interesting. Also, it says, can I just say Seattle was the greatest advertiser they've ever seen? Yes.
The Avatar of Revelation Publications, in fact.
I'm gonna pair up these actors in pairs that I think were natural, and since we've already mentioned it, Lance mentioned it, I'm gonna go straight to Timothy Dalton and Anthony Hopkins. Anthony Hopkins playing Richard of Richard the First fame, Richard the Lionheart, who would go on to be King of England and hardly be in England for most of his reign. And Timothy Dalton, Philip II of France. Now, it's interesting what you said, Lance, because I agree with you. I think that Timothy Dalton as Philip outshined Anthony Hopkins for most of the film. And I was curious. I thought that a lot of it had to do with the writing and the screenplay because and there's Jeff. How you doing, Jeff?
Hey, we haven't been on air in so long. I kind of forgot.
No problem. No worries. We're always happy when you join us. So we are talking about the cast now, and we're talking about Timothy Dalton and Anthony Hopkins together. And Lance had pointed out that he thought that Timothy Dalton in particular outshined Anthony Hopkins in this film. And I kind of agreed, although I think that it has something to do with the parts that they played, because I think Richard gets completely played by Philip II here, especially when he exposes the homosexuality of Richard to his father. And I think that part, that vulnerability is when Anthony Hopkins shined, when he finally owned the entirety of who he was to his father, and then found out that his father really didn't care, So that's where I was on that. But I wanted to see what you thought about that, Lance, and I'm going to go around the horn on also about these two actors' performances in this film. So,
well, I think Timothy Dalton played it right. He didn't play it foppish, and you know what I mean. He didn't play maybe what we think is a stereotypical Frenchman royalty of the time. I mean, he played it like a badass. And, he stood toe to toe with everybody. I'm not a kid, I'm not your little man. And I love that idea of how he played that character. And he stood firm the entire time he was on screen. And I can see why they wanted to cast him as James Bond in On Your Majesty's Secret Service right then and there. But having said that, him being a good upstart performer knew he wasn't old enough to play Bond, so he turned it down at the time. He could have been on Your Majesty's Secret Service. So not only do you see that in his performance, you kind of get the vibe of him professionally. But I think, man, he nailed it. He looked cool. He was wardrobed awesomely. It's like, wow, he had those great sharp features. I mean, he looked like the evil prince more than he did the foppish prince and our king. And I thought, okay, I'm impressed. And I had forgotten about this until he was on screen. I was like, oh, wow, there's Timothy Dalton. Oh, wow, he's nailing it. He's stealing scenes. This is pretty cool. I thought his performance is just dynamite.
I think that given a different casting, he could have been an excellent Prince John in the mold of Prince John from the older Robin Hood movies, and we will get to Prince John in a little bit, but they really they were not kind to John in this film. So
no.
Let's go to Steve. What did you think of Timothy Dalton and Anthony Hopkins as Philip II and Richard I, respectively?
I think that's generally on target, and I do agree with you that I think it's the writing that kind of made a difference in the case of Hopkins, because I don't think he had quite as much meat to work with. But I agree that when he's allowed to be vulnerable, that's when Richard is interesting. That is when Hopkins really starts to lean into that, because you're expecting Richard I to be the guy from the Robin Hood stories, and he's not. Like they show a bit more of the man, behind that legend. And it turns out this is a guy who has been manipulated his whole life by his mother, and he is completely, and he's dealing with his whole issues, with his sexuality and everything going on with Philip and whatnot. And I feel like you see a character that is very nuanced and not what you expect, and I dig that. Likewise, I think Timothy Dalton really worked, and I will say at first I didn't even know that was Timothy Dalton. I had to actually look at the cast. I'm like, what? This is Timothy Dalton?
Very
young.
Dalton.
Very young. But at the same time, it's like thinking about what he's become since then. The kind of actor he's grown into. I'm like, yeah, I can absolutely believe that he would deliver this kind of performance at that age. And the thing that I really like of is that for the most part, he is very enigmatic. He is hedging his bets. He is non-committal. He is very regal. He is very dignified the entire time, and he puts up with Henry this nonsense the whole way through. And then he drops the mask. And when he drops the mask, it is awesome, because that's when he starts telling Henry, I'm not a boy, and actually proving why he is king. Why he deserves to be on that throne. And it's quite impressive. That you have somebody who was relatively new to the scene, and he's standing up to a guy like Peter O'Toole, who at that time was in his prime. Like, that was impressive. That I mean, you start seeing you start seeing that, and yeah, I feel like Hopkins probably could have done better, I guess, but I think that he was not as served by the script as a lot of the other characters were. Eleanor, for example, is very well served by the script, and it shows. Richard, I kind of feel like, I think aside from the writing against type, you don't get to see that as much. But Hopkins, I think, still managed to do the best he could at that time with what he had. It just wasn't as strong as what Dalton had, and I think that came across.
Yeah, and I think, it's still a good performance. I just think that the performance of Dalton and what he was given was better, and and the way that he was allowed. He was going toe to toe as Philip against Henry II and holding his own. It's just powerful stuff, and watching it, it's absolutely fascinating to watch Henry's respect for Philip grow and grow to the point where you think that he almost wishes that Philip was his son and not the other three. So,
I think he definitely thinks that.
Yeah, I got that vibe, which was, wow, that's hardcore. And watching Dalton and Hopkins in particular, there are times where I wonder how they were directed, which we'll never know, especially with a Peter O'Toole around and a Katharine Hepburn, because they can be influential in another performer's performance, and as a director, sometimes you're kind of like, shut up and back off. That's not your job to do. And I would have to think, as maybe a brash American attitude, if you're directing a Peter Dalton, especially going up against Peter O'Toole, I'd be saying something like, don't take any shit from this drunken Irishman. You get in there and you let him have it. That's what I want to see. And then let's roll, but I would have loved to be a fly on the wall for this production. I would have loved to see how they were directed. And that goes to now movie legend and lore. But boy, when watching something like this, it makes, the nape of my neck tingle to go, man, how did they do that? What did they say to get those performances? We'll never know.
And another comment from Mike here, he says, do you think Richard was the returning king in the Robin Hood story? That's the legend,
Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah. The history is not exactly like that at all. Yeah. John was nowhere near as conniving and
he was not as punchable as Claude Rains.
Yeah.
Right.
But John gets credit nowadays in histories for things that he had nothing to do with either. But that's a history podcast, which is a whole different thing.
This John was pretty damn punchable in my opinion.
Yeah. Although I will say, and before I pass it to Jeff, just kind of leading in, I think it was interesting what they wrote for Richard in this movie, since up to this point, Richard the Lionheart was lionized in England. He was held up as a incredible example of the English monarchy and of leadership when he was really a failed king. And they didn't pull any punches on Richard in this one, just like they didn't pull any punches with John, Right. And so I would be curious to know how that was received in British society at the time. And with that, I'm going to leave it to Jeff to talk about Timothy Dalton and Richard.
Now, you make such an excellent point right there about Richard being lionized, and I do find it because there's. This isn't the only piece I've seen which talked about Richard's possible homosexuality and things like that. And so there's, they have to be aware of that. And that kind of goes against the sort of thing you would expect out of your king, your ruler, your leader. And yet at the same time, we see Katharine Hepburn, she's firing off. Like Ed Henry is like, oh, you never one of the stable boys. It's kind of a common thing,
right.
Like men have always got to have some way to satisfy their needs. If the milkmaid wasn't around, so I guess the stable boy will do that sort of thing. Or maybe there's always a bit of that proclivity going on in the upper class. But this
movie was quite ahead of its time in the way it talked about homosexuality as not sensationalized. It was just a part of life,
Right.
So
and
Henry probably
incestual
slept with everybody that
relationships.
moved anyway. You know, whatever gender
Yeah.
he just slept
Right.
with everybody he found attractive.
But he obviously didn't go that. But on to Richard. I remember watching the movie Ty Cobb. It appeared on HBO. It had Richard Arliss and Tommy Lee Jones playing Ty Cobb. And Arliss is writing this story about Ty Cobb, trying to get to the root of him. And he finds out that he was a very unpleasant person. He was quite racist. He was super aggressive, a drunkard, a womanizer, all this. But all these people around him, all these other sports writers, talk about what an amazing ball player is and a gentleman. And after spending all this time with him, he decides that the legend is more important than the man. And so that's the story he tells. And I think perhaps that's the case here with Richard as well. Sometimes having that icon is more important than like knowing all the flaws. Like I know there are people who like would go on about things like, oh, Ben Franklin went over to France and partied his ass off, but it served a purpose in terms of developing America. It wasn't necessarily like he was a whore dog going to party. So
it's like Liberty Valance, print the legend.
Yeah, yep.
That's my kind of take on things. But as for the actors and the scenes themselves, now, right off the bat, I mean, we all know Anthony Hopkins is an amazing performer when he's given a chance to do what he needs to do, even at this stage in his career. And it's these moments of vulnerability that we get. I'm very in line with what Stephen Lance has said here, that we really get to see full, peak Anthony Hopkins. I love the scenes with him and Katharine Hepburn where you see his struggle with his mother, who he hates for some previous slight. And she still manages to worm her way in and get him to give up this, because as any good child would want, even in an abusive relationship, you still want the love and approval of your parents. And that is so evident here, even though when he literally puts on his armor, but his armor has chinks, and his mother and father know how to find those chinks and stab to the heart. And I really enjoyed watching that. But like you guys have pointed out, I think his best scene, the most pivotal scene for him, is the revelation of his homosexual affair with Timothy Dalton, and knowing how his father feels about that, and the fact that for Dalton, it was all just court manipulation. The French Prince has clearly learned his skill of being a courtier and a ruler, and as you rightly pointed out, Steve, I got the vibe that Henry was like, man, this guy should have been my son, because he's got all the qualities I like. If you took all the best qualities from each of his three sons, you would end up with this French Prince, and like none of their negatives, because he's everything Henry wanted out of a son. He goes on talking about like, oh, you treat your boys cruel. It's like, oh, that's great. That'll make them good rulers. I want them to be cruel. I want them to like learn this from me. But that moment is pretty heartbreaking, because not only has he lost his father in this moment, but he's also lost the love of this man that he genuinely loved. And it's just, there's no more armor. There's no more pretense. It's not just a moment of outrage. It is all over his face. His heart is on the floor and trampled.
Well, I think it's worse than losing the love. He realizes that this guy never loved him in the first place.
Never.
And I have to really respect Anthony Hopkins and the way he shows it physically. Like it never comes across necessarily in the lines, but you see on his face that this guy's been shattered, and when he finds this out, and I think it's great.
I have to agree. I love that. I love seeing the facial context, or like what I've heard some actors call the face journey, as you just see the story being told as the expression changes. This is a bit of a tangent, but like one of my favorite scenes is Christian Haydenson in the Star Wars movie when Padme tells him she's pregnant, and you, without a single line, you watch all these thoughts go through his head as he's figuring out what this means in context to their life together and his role as a Jedi, and just how this is like wonderful and horribly complicated all at the same time. And we get this again here, and just not even just the face, but like these subtle changes in body posture. I'm a keen observer of like body language, and you can see him sort of just deflate as this is all happening, and it's like, oh, it's such a powerful scene. It just moves you. You're made out of rock if this didn't move you.
Yeah,
What I like so much about Timothy Dalton is like, holy cow, this guy had star power out of the gate, man. Holding his own against Peter O'Toole, against Anthony Hopkins, and not only that, but just seeing the character of Philip against Henry like this, and you've got to have a tremendous amount of talent and charisma to pull that off. He's supposed to be a 17-year-old French king up against this this old man who has slain all the dragons that life has ever thrown at him, whether they be in his family or outside of his castle gates. And Dalton kills it. He is so equal to the task. He's so impressive. And like you guys said, the big reveal when you find out just how devious he is, just how plotted he is. And I love how the script keeps giving you nods of that before you finally get there, when he just refuses to play Henry's games, because that's a losing thing. You can't play Henry's game. And he's like, oh, I'm going to walk away. And he's like, oh, you don't even know how to play the game. Get back here. We're just getting started. And he's like, yeah, fine, I'll leave. And he's telling things like, well, I'm going to attack. He's like, oh, fine, I'll surrender. And Henry thinks
in fine French fashion, by the way.
Well,
absolutely.
Henry thinks that's a win. Is I won. You've just told me all of your plans. Like, that doesn't change the fact that the plan's going to work. If you ask me, Philip won, and he keeps winning throughout the entire film. Philip keeps winning, and the way Dalton handles that with such grace. Oh,
well,
powerful.
And that leads into the next two actors, and Philip, the character, is playing not only Henry. I mean, he's trying to play Eleanor and Henry to a certain extent, but they're experienced at the game and they know what's going on and they're playing him back. But who he's really playing are Henry's three sons, who are out of their depth. And that brings us to the other two. We have Jeffrey, played by John Castle, who would go on to be in RoboCop, among many other films, a very respected actor, a very powerful actor. And then the other prince is John, who was played by Nigel Terry, who was in Excalibur, among many other things.
Like what a great transition. He goes from like being the sniveling little John to the ultimate king of England as Arthur.
Yeah.
Now, and I'm going to go to Steve first on this one, but I will be honest with you. I thought that these two performances, although they're definitely supporting performances, they're more in the background, although they do have some significant plot, points to move the plot forward in the film. Were just as powerful as anybody else. I think Jeffrey comes off as an absolute lunatic. I mean, he is a Machiavellian figure. And then John is the kind of guy, you look at him, you just want to excuse my language, you just want to bitch slap him. It's like he's just that pathetic. And the fact that Nigel Terry was brought out this character when he could be a very powerful and regal figure as well, shows how well he was able to act in this role.
Well, I'd say, Steve didn't recognize Timothy Dalton in this role. Nigel Terry was so cemented in my mind as King Arthur that when I first watched this movie, I didn't recognize him at all.
Yeah. And then you find out that at first John seems pitiable, and then he's just disgusting because he's just as craven as any of them and was playing on his father to get what he wanted as well. So, but with that, what did you think of these two actors in this role, Nigel Terry and John Castle, Steve?
I will say from the start that these are two of the worst people. These are people you do not want anywhere near power for completely different reasons. I will say Castle as Jeffrey is, Castle as Jeffrey is a complete sociopath. I mean, absolutely cold, conniving sociopath. This is a guy who is just, vying for power every which way he can, and he's learned his lessons very well from Eleanor and from Henry to a certain extent. This is all this guy cares about, and this lines up historically because he was somebody who had lined up a revolt. I guess I don't remember if it was against Henry or Richard, but he
Henry.
was involved in that. It was Henry. Okay,
he did twice.
Yeah. So he is really that kind of a scoundrel as he's portrayed here. So perfect casting, because this guy absolutely nails how cold and conniving he is. He's willing to switch allegiances and loyalties on a whim, depending on what he gets out of it. Absolutely just wonderful as the middle child who is just like, you're not going to go anywhere near near the throne. You're just never going to get that. So he's content to connive and manipulate his way to what power he can get, and that definitely comes across. Nigel Terry, this is what he's basically a kind of like, I would say almost like a Caligula, in the sense that this is somebody who is essentially this is somebody who absolutely does not have the temperament to be anywhere near power. He's a spoiled child. And and I will say Nigel Terry does play against what you would expect if all you know of him is playing King Arthur. So he has definitely, I would agree with Jeff, had this arc, where he's gone, from playing this person, who is completely unsuited to the role, to being the ultimate embodiment of kingliness. And that shows the depth of how good Terry is as an actor, and how much he has grown since then. And I think it took basically playing against guys like Peter O'Toole and Anthony Hopkins and Timothy Dalton to really be able to get the chops that he needed for that role. And I think he definitely learned from this movie.
But to the point we were talking about before, how amazing is it for you to be in a production and to learn your craft while watching a Peter O'Toole and a Katharine Hepburn perform?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you have to raise your game if you're going to survive, and he did. I mean, absolutely. He did. He definitely rise to the level of the material, and I think that definitely pretty much everybody does a good job, to some extent or another. But you can definitely see that Terry's kind of thinking, okay, these guys are so much bigger than I am. I have to bring it, and I think he did.
Absolutely, and I will say, like I said before I go over to Jeff, and I'm going to go to Lance. They did John dirty in this one, and granted, he's a scoundrel in history. He is not a figure that we should, take a lot of pity on. Although he did some things reluctantly that turned out well for England. But I mean, they almost combined two of the most notorious scandals in history, or scoundrels in history, into one person. They gave him Richard III's looks and John's personality. It's like, come on. I mean, Jesus. I mean, there's piling on, and then there's piling on. But to Jeff, what did you think of John Castle and Nigel Terry in these roles?
All right. Now, the thing about John Castle is there's something about him in this role that reminds me a great deal of Oliver Reed. And if you're a fan of Oliver Reed, he has played a lot of sociopathic roles. So maybe there's a page out of it.
And quietly. Not ranting and raving. He does it very quietly, which I think you nailed that Oliver Reed thing.
Which is what I like about his portrayal here of Geoffrey so much. Because one of the things this film did is it subverted a number of expectations for me in very clever ways. Our introductions to the three sons sort of lead you astray a little bit. When we see Richard, he's in the midst of a duel or a practice. I'm thinking a duel because he's a hair away from killing the person he's fighting, and he has to be stopped. And I kept waiting to see Richard be this homicidal maniac in this story, but that never actually happened.
Oh, but there is a homicidal maniac. Well, there is a maniac who likes homicide in the story, and it's Geoffrey. So,
but there's also the thing. So when I first see Geoffrey, I was actually very much on Geoffrey's side when it came to the three sons. I thought Richard was just too brutal, especially after the start of that. Like, oh, I can't trust Richard. He's going to be lopping off heads like Henry V or something. When we see John, John looks like the eager son, the favored son. He's doing everything his father does. He's coming along nicely. He can hold his own for a time with Henry in sparring. And then we start to see how he really is. Oh, he is just a horrible little person. And again, the body language thing is a very interesting change, because when he's initially with his father, he's standing tall and he's proud. He's getting all these accolades. But as the movie goes on, his posture crunches down more and more and more. He literally, before your eyes, kind of turns into Gollum. He squashes his, especially when he's around his more stalwart brothers. You watch as his shoulders start to slump, his head starts to lean forward like a vulture.
I think I'm beginning to see the Richard III comparisons, because Richard III was much the same.
Yeah.
So there's that. And when we see Joffrey, what's he doing? He's very successfully leading men, not in the field as Richard does, but from afar. So, like, okay, he has a tactical mind. He's a commander. And we see he leads these soldiers on the beach.
Mm-hmm. One note on that scene, though. The important part about that scene is he's leading both sides. He's having people kill each other because he wants them to.
Yeah, and that's his whole character. He leads both sides against each other,
and enjoying it. He's getting his rocks off on watching it. So
I didn't actually pick up on that. So wow,
total sociopath.
I'd realized that from the beginning. Like, I was like, okay, yeah, this guy is nuts. Because when I first watched it in that context, I'm initially on his side, because he seems to actually be the most level-headed, the most practical. He's very reserved. He doesn't get angry like Richard, and he doesn't get petulant like John. And you start thinking, well, maybe this guy's kind of been done dirty. But then as the story progresses, we do see more and more of his character, just how he really wants to be at that Philip level, but he's not quite there. Philip's better at the game. But one of my favorite things to see is when he proposes killing Henry. And Henry is like, I'll take all three of you on down in the wine cellar. I was waiting for Joffrey to kind of okay, Joffrey, let's see what you got. You've been very intellectual about things, about your machinations, but what have you got physically? And I love the moment where Henry lunges at him and he leans back. He's got his dagger and he's like, oh, okay. So you're just a big pussy. I get it. You're like you guys said, he's Machiavellian. He's a schemer. That's what he's good at. But he's kind of Comatus from Gladiator. That's what he's all about.
And I will say,
Joffrey Baratheon.
In history, he died a rather bad death after a fall during a jousting accident in a tournament, and it sounds like he died a painful and long death. And I'll just leave it at that. You can go read the history if you want. But yeah,
he deserves it.
Yeah. So, Lance, what did you think about these two characters? I'm curious what you're going to bring. On the characters or the actors' performances as well. What did you think of them? Because
I think Castle was always he was in Blow Up. We reviewed Blow Up, and he played the introverted, flaky artist type that seemed to be introspective.
Crap. I forgot that he was in Blow Up.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Which now you look at how he plays Jeffrey, which is kind of, to me, an unsettling calm and collectedness. It's like, okay, is he going to snap at any moment? And I think the most emotion he shows is when he does recoil from Henry II when he's challenged. It's like, okay, there's your true colors. But he's the guy that just seems to be on the polar opposite of Timothy Dalton, which I liked, but not he wasn't as debonair. He wasn't as flamboyant. He knew he can stay in the shadows behind the curtain, and I think that's what made the role work. He just played it with a calm collectedness. It's like, okay, I'm going to think about it, which I liked. and then you get Nigel Terry as John, and he played the perfect slack-jawed, spoiled brat that I have seen. I haven't seen that in a long time, and he played it
stupid
perfectly
so well.
Yeah, and it was like
John is the least intellectual out of anybody in the family.
Right, and he deserves nothing. It's like, and yet he's poised for greatness. So you can see his arrogance turn into nothing but humiliation in the end. And once again, top-notch performances by these upstarts, and history is being made with this film. History is being made.
And I will say, from a historical perspective, I did my research. I've not found any evidence that Henry preferred John over the throne over anybody else. Although it made interesting drama in the film to see Eleanor knowing exactly what John's qualities were and saying, no way in hell should he ever sniff the throne. So,
yeah, it does make sense for the story, though. I mean, you definitely have a lot of this is the game that Henry's playing against Eleanor. The idea that Eleanor would favor her eldest son makes sense. And so because of that, Henry's favoring the younger one, and playing them against each other. That's the Game of Thrones being played.
My take on it was like, if John gets in the power, he is Joffrey Baratheon.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, and
exactly.
you could almost believe that Henry did all of the stuff with John just to piss Eleanor off, because he just enjoyed that. Which brings us to the final two actors we have to talk about. And before I talked about them, one of the things I want to mention, if you watch this film, go back and watch Beckett first, because even the stuff with the children is there, where Eleanor is there with her mother, and Henry is railing against them, and then the three kids who are much younger in that movie come in, and he's like, "You're a bunch of swine. Get out of my sight. I don't want to see you. I hate all of you." And that seems to be pretty accurate. And they carry that right forward into this movie. And like I said, this movie is not a planned sequel. It's a different studio. But these two movies dovetail together so well, you couldn't have planned it better. So that brings us then to Eleanor of Aquitaine, played by Katharine Hepburn, one of the shrewdest women in history, one of the most powerful women in European history, especially at the time, played by an incredible actress. Although it is a little strange that she doesn't even try and affect an English accent, which you get past it. And then Peter O'Toole playing Henry II. And I'm going to go to Lance first on this one. I will just say real quick, for me, the amazing part about this is that, yes, this movie is Game of Thrones and everything. It is a political squabble. There are high stakes going on. It's a high stakes drama. It's a relationship drama among this family. But it also is a love-hate relationship movie between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. And the way the movie ends, it ends on a love-hate relationship between the two. And caught in between all that is the one sympathetic character in all of this, which is Alice, played by Jane Marrow. And I'm going to throw her in there as well, because she's got a smaller part. But God, you feel bad for this woman, because she is just in the middle of all of this shit. And she's being passed around from person to person as a punching bag. And you're just like, oh, my Lord. So over to you, Lance. What did you think about all this?
Well, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, the time in history, the people, everything that's going on, I'm like, man, the plague didn't work. It should have just wiped them all out. We would have been better off. How are they protected? I have no sympathy or pity for any of these characters.
It's all that incredibly great food.
I'm like, this is just terrible. Family dysfunction, at its best. But when you look at how it was cast, I can't see it being cast any other way. It's just one of those happy things that happens in cinema. And, Katharine Hepburn being 61 years old, and of course, Eleanor being 61 years old at the time, kind of blew my mind. I'm like, oh, wow, they've already outlived society. It was amazing. Even with Henry being 50, what does he die like 6 years later or something?
Yeah, Henry is 50. I'm 52. Henry was 50, and he was considered ancient at the time, which blows my mind.
does in fact mention that he has outlived the majority of his enemies in the film.
Right,
Yeah.
which is always something. But you have these two seasoned performers, and yeah, O'Toole was at the top of his game at 36 years old. Like I said before, you can see the mileage. And yes, at that time when he's that big, yes, he was drunk at times. Yes, he was hungover. Did that lend to the performance? Maybe it did, with a little bit of annoyance, a little bit of not feeling well, a little bit of vulnerability. But it was a Catherine Hepburn that kept him in line, because it was like, no, this is a professional production. Don't show up late. Don't show up drunk. Don't show up hungover. She was like the mother of everyone, because hey, you're there to do a job, and I can see how that reflected in everybody's performance. And of course, O'Toole has nothing on Catherine Hepburn. He has nothing on her. She rolls in there. It's just go time, and I think that's one of those things when it comes down to casting. You just cast the right person, and it worked out. I was impressed all around, and the stamina you have to keep doing this is amazing.
I also have to say, before I pass it on to Jeff, we've talked about the bravery of this film in the casting choices. They cast a number of young actors, and their approach to something like homosexuality, which was they approached the topic, they weren't afraid of it, but they didn't sensationalize it. The other thing I got to say is, you got to have some stones to cast an Irishman as an English king who is well respected. So that's all I'm going to say. So, and we'll just leave it at that. But if you know, you know. So over to Jeff.
Yeah, especially an Irishman. I mean, it's interesting enough when you get like a Scot like Sean Connery playing the king of England, but Irish is even more contentious.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
I'm sure that raised quite a few eyebrows on the other side of the pond. So,
and yet, like Lance said, I can't think of it going any other way. I generally prefer, if people are playing a role, that they embody the character. Like I would generally prefer that somebody playing Eleanor would have an English accent, but Katharine Hepburn is such a queen of the cinema and such a consummate performer. As soon as she starts speaking, I don't care. And that's how much she brings me in. It doesn't break my immersion.
And it goes back to the charisma that Lance is always talking about,
Yeah.
which this movie has in spades. So,
for sure. It's like her outstanding body of work and the professionalism that she brings to things. It can't help but win you over. I'm so drawn into everything she's doing on screen, and that really is true of pretty much everybody who's on the screen in this film. This film is such a tour de force, but you can just see she just has that regal bearing, and I love the back and forth between her and Henry, because there is that love-hate relationship. You see it, like the claws are out, the knives are firmly planted between shoulder blades, but then they have these other moments where they, in some ways, it reminded me of to take it back to Game of Thrones, Cersei and King Baratheon, where they stop hating each other a moment or two to have these little heart to hearts. It's like, she says, "Did you ever love me?" And he's like, "No, I always loved Ned's sister."
yeah.
Which is heartbreaking, but as good as those two actors are, it has nothing compared to this, because that's really the crux of all of this movie. It's all about this relationship and how it dovetails into everybody surrounding them, and it's so potent that there's times you just, like, even though the history of it is not the case, you want them to, like, let's make the multiverse, like let's have these guys work it out and get back together. What a powerful force they would be if they could work it out, but they couldn't work it out, and Henry had his roving eye and his roving ways, and the venom.
So does she, though. So.
Yes, she did.
Yep.
Well, fair is fair. Evidently, I don't know who started first, but like there's clearly that sort of thing going on, and it's funny too, because kind of like the casual homosexuality, there's also that sort of thing that went on in history, and a lot of people just kind of like yeah, we'll just keep this out of sight, ignore the man behind the curtain.
Well,
But it was quite a sticking point here. What are you saying?
I was going to say before, I was going to say it's also one of the things that got me in this was how casually they talked about the use of sex as a weapon and a political tool. And the fact is, and this is historically documented, Eleanor of Aquitaine, even in her 60s, was a cougar. She was seducing people and cementing alliances with sex against her husband. She led rebellions against her husband. So
Henry's mentioning that about that, like, her visitations, who's visiting her island and stuff like that, and if it's bearing any fruit. And I love how she started turning. I was like, "Hey, did I sleep with your dad?" Like, and that's something that's like just recalled him, and she uses that multiple times. Like, well, I didn't, but maybe I did, and it's so vicious. And Henry himself can be equally vicious, but he's a roaring lion as opposed to like a gaudy snake in this relationship they have. But then you see the actual pain as well in these quieter moments, and both of them sell it just so doggone well. But then there's these two master manipulators. You see their human frailties in these performances when Eleanor overplays her hand. It's like, oh, I'm going to annul the marriage. I'm going to go off. I'm going to marry this. I'm going to make whole new sons. Like, screw all of you guys. And then Eleanor oversteps. She's like, oh, I'm going to do all this. Well, then he changes all of her plans because she got too happy with herself. She should have done that quietly. And there's this, because I think Henry's always playing it as a game, there's this constant level of one-upmanship. It was always so important to each of them to win. They didn't think about how to win often as much as the winning. And, when O'Toole actually experiences these emotional moments where he loves and hates his family at the same time. And you can see when he's crushed, when he throws his dagger down and he realizes, like, I have nobody, I have nothing. And then at the end, it's surprisingly joyous as the two of them go like, are you going to bring me out for you? Of course, we'll do this again. Like there's this, it's so strange and chaotic that normal people can't really relate to that. And yet the way these two performers handle it, you never just hate them. You're always kind of on their side. And that's brilliant in both the charisma they have and their acting. And I love that even Alice has her moment with Eleanor when she's like, I've never been anything but you were my handmaiden and all this. But even they have this breakdown, a moment that you can only have between two women who know of love and loss. And that was a beautiful moment to have as well. So
and all of you, I was gonna say, and all of you thought Christmas with your families was awkward.
But is this a Christmas movie? I don't know.
I guess according to some people out there, it is. So
I guess the Die Hard would be.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say before I pass it on to Steve real quick is that it also shows, there's a scene in there that shows Henry's hypocrisy, because he threatens to marry Alice off to John and then father his own grandchildren, technically. And I believe he would do it. In fact, there were a lot of kings that did do that. We just don't talk about it. And so it makes you wonder, okay, it's an interesting line they put in there for Eleanor. So, Steve, what did you think of Peter O'Toole and Captain Hepburn in these roles?
Oh, they're absolutely stellar. They're absolutely phenomenal. And a lot of it is what, we usually talk about, charisma. I mean, you can definitely see that both of them are oozing it. You have, Peter O'Toole, who at that time was in his complete prime and comes across completely convincingly as Henry. And then you have this grand dame from the golden age of Hollywood, who, comes from, upper class Connecticut, sort of upbringing, and she brings it to this role. And she's so good in it, as so convincing as this upper class manipulator, that you don't really care that her accent isn't English. You really don't. I mean, it's definitely clearly that it's this New England sort of accent, and you just don't care because how well she's bringing it. But on top of that, they have this sexual tension that is amazing, and this is what really brings almost a rom-com sort of flavor to their interactions. It feels like a rom-com with these people sniping at each other. At the same time, it's like, yeah, get a room.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's disturbing too, because you're like, this should not be a romantic comedy. So.
Yeah, it should not be, because it's like these two are completely incompatible, and and a lot of it, and all they do is scheme at each other, and because to them it's about dominating each other. It's not about being a partnership. It's about, I want to be in charge.
It's almost like foreplay for them, though.
It has to be that way because we're talking about power. We're talking about the who's in charge, the king or the queen, and neither one is willing to give an inch. And this is the whole thing with Henry, is that his problem is that he can't let go of power, because this is the guy who has fought his entire life to attain it. And he's like, yeah, if I let go of power, you die. You play the Game of Thrones or you die. And so, that's been his whole arc this whole time, is like, okay, he has to learn to give a little, because otherwise he loses his entire family and his entire kingdom. And he kind of realizes at that point, and even then he can't completely give up everything. She's got to go back to that island, under Glock and Key, all these other things. He just gives it enough of a reign, to, where it doesn't completely destroy the kingdom. But so even then, they don't completely, even when King Henry seems to learn things, he doesn't learn enough, and it's just completely fascinating. And this is a completely dysfunctional, relationship. And it starts with these two. They're constantly manipulating each other. They're constantly sniping at each other. They're turning their kids against each other. They're doing this back and forth about, trying to hurt each other emotionally, to get advantage in some way. And the whole thing where, Katharine Hepburn is like, oh yeah, maybe I slept with your dad and maybe it didn't. And who the hell knows, because she has reason to lie either way. You can't trust a word she says. You can't trust a word either of them say. And it's just, it's really fascinating to watch these two dysfunctional, horrible people, play this game against each other. And yet they're so charismatic and it's written so well that you can't take your eyes off of these two. It's just so entertaining. You can get an entire movie just off these two sniping at each other.
Mm-hmm.
And they just, both of them love to turn the knife. They just love to turn that knife. And it's like, this movie reminded me, not that I need any reminder, but I don't want to be powerful or famous. I'm happy with my normal life. Thank you very much. So
talking about this was like foreplay to them, Nim. I help but think, like, I bet these two did a lot of hate fucking.
Yeah, probably.
Oh, I'm certain that they were doing it. They probably were doing it during the whole time that she was over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so we spent quite a lot of time on the cast, and it's what I expected. But there is one final aspect I wanted to get to. We love to talk about production. The production of the film, production value. And I'm going to go around to each of us real quick to talk about things. I'm going to kick it off, though, and I'm just going to go around the horn in order. The first thing I want to talk about, I want to talk about the color palette of the film. It is very earth tone. It's not especially regal, and I think that was a deliberate choice. I mean, Henry most of the time is wearing brown, which is the most neutral and boring of colors. And I think that was on purpose, so that they didn't oversell the grandeur of these people and of the royalty. It's like, here is this family that happens to be powerful and important, but we don't want you to concentrate on all of that. We want you to concentrate on all of the bullshit that they're doing to each other. And I think it was very effective, because nobody looks especially, how does it say, regal or beautiful in this film, except for Timothy Dalton.
Yeah.
In fact, some of them look especially dirty, John. I mean,
on his face, everything.
Yeah. So, and I think that's a deliberate choice, and I think it was a smart choice for the film, and I appreciate it, and it really stands out. I've watched this movie a number of times, but when I watched it this time with an eye for this podcast, I mean, it's one of the first things that stood out to me is that the first time you meet this great king, Henry II, he is clad in the simplest of garments, and it's all brown. So I was really struck by that. Steve, anything that stood out for you on the production of the film?
It feels like a stage production that has been brought to movie quality, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And it really was. I mean, this was a play originally. It was written as a play, and it has that sort of feel. Like a lot of the sets, they feel like Hollywood sort of stages of that time. But they're, and they're elaborate enough, and they're convincing enough, and they got plenty, of the frills. The costume design is very good in all of this, but it's not like designed the way that you would sort of see it today, where they're like the eye is for gritty realism or any of this other stuff. No, it's not anything like that. It is designed to really put the focus on the characters and their drama first. The elements around them are enough to make it convincing. You don't want to look at anything other than these people on the stage saying these lines. Because the real things that your eye is drawn to is the performances of these star quality actors, like every single one of them, and what is going on and what people are saying, because that's where the power is. It's where the drama is. So it's just good enough to be convincing. It's good enough, to, keep the immersion of the story, but it's not necessarily, I don't feel, yeah, it's really well done, but it's not like, where you would see and like we talked about with Elizabeth. You don't see that kind of really lavish sort of background, on the walls and things like that. That's not really what the focus is. The focus is on the drama and the stage first, and it feels like a very stagey kind of film, which is not a bad thing at all. That's exactly what this movie is, and it's exactly what it should be. I have no problems with it.
That's such an interesting point, because if you look at the scenes of the film, there are very few scenes where there are more than 2 or 3 characters in the scene, which is very, stage play, in the sense of like a Shakespeare or something like that. It's kind of interesting. Lance, production.
Oh, it's once again, this is a top-notch production. This is everything done professionally, from the costumes to the cinematography. I mean, Margaret first did the costumes, and I guess there was something about having them wear their costumes for rehearsals and throughout the shooting day, because you're under these halogen lights and you're sweating like a pig, so they wanted them to make it look a little more soiled, a little more
nice.
lived in. Aside from Katharine Hepburn, who I guess she made the bid that, well, the color should be a little bit more brighter for Eleanor, because she believes she traveled to the Middle East and she would want to show that fashion. So she kind of stands out a little bit more costume wise than everybody else, who is basically drab, and they are functionally living, I would like to always put it. Although still a little glamored in the hairstyles. I would like to see a little more grease in the hair, but that's the 60s and 70s. But every shot in this movie is a glamour shot. And Nem, you were talking about the color palette. Douglas Slocum actually was the cinematographer on this, and he did the first 3 Indiana Jones movies. And you can see the color palettes just as an example. I guess 50T, which is a tungsten balanced film, was used for Lion in the Winter. Now that leans towards a little more warmth, so it brings out your oranges, your browns.
And that's what I was seeing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and you nailed it, because in a sense, there was that look of what would it look like if it was a tapestry or something that Douglas Slocum was going for. I can see what he was after. But you burn tungsten balanced lights when you're doing that, which is 3,200 degrees Kelvin. Now, back then, you can see the light pouring on them. I mean, I can just see them getting beamed with light. And obviously, that was probably filtered or maybe later on color corrected. But that adds an amazing look when you use tungsten. Now, I want to guess they used a daylight balanced film when they were outside. But if they didn't, all you do is throw a filter over your lens when you're shooting tungsten. You lose a stop, but it brings out the richness in the colors. It brings out the earth tones. I love the tungsten balanced film stocks. I mean, they're a little bit difficult to work with, just a little bit. But if you photograph it well enough, you're going to get that painting look. It's going to look like a painting. It's going to have saturation and it's going to have contrast, versus what you see on the video today, which is dull, dark, and muddy. They can't get the colors like they can with a good daylight balance, or especially a tungsten balanced film. You just can't do that on video. So this is a perfect example of the photography shining, even though it's invisible. It's the performance, like everybody says, that takes precedence, the performances. But if you freeze frame any moment of this film, it's a glamour shot. It's perfectly composed. It's perfectly photographed. It's lit well. Everything looks like a tapestry or a painting. So that is production design. That's all in place before anybody steps on set. So that's what I think is a lessons learned for modern movie makers. You watch a movie like this. This was designed. It wasn't just throwing up a camera and hitting record. It was all designed, and that means professionalism.
That is amazing that you point that out, because it's like, I obviously don't have any of that technical knowledge, but as a viewer and as a critic, I am picking that up, because those tones, that warm feeling, evokes a certain emotion in me, which is the exact opposite. It's a warm family feeling, a hearth feeling. Yeah. Meanwhile, there's these horrible people doing horrible things to each other on screen. So.
And why wouldn't it be in full color? I mean, you look at like some of the new Ridley Scott movies when he's doing like The Last Duel or something, and everything's so dark and oversaturated and overly bleak. It's like, well, don't forget about, you have a performer there, light them a little bit. That's what they're there for. I see that mistake so much nowadays, and it's annoying. Whereas you go back in time, and we see when it's produced professionally like this, how it enhances performance. Photography is important. You can't just diss it. You can't just fix it in post. You got to do it up front. And this is a perfect example of it. This and Beckett. I mean, Beckett looked amazing. I mean, I was even like, wow, I didn't realize this movie was photographed this well, but here we go.
And they took a completely different approach. I mean, that one is about very regal, and regal looking, and it's very stylish and everything else, and yet it still works. But that's a whole other movie, and maybe we will get back to that movie at some point. But I'm going to go to Jeff on production before we're going to do final thoughts and wrap this up.
Actually, you guys have hit on a few things that I was going to talk about anyway, so this is going to be a perfect segue. To your point, Nim, you have a film where the subject is all these horrible people, and if they had been lit cooler, you would have had no connection with them at all. They would have all just come across as pasty monsters. Like, oh, they're all very hateable. But you said the warmness of the tones gave you this warm sort of family feeling. So subconsciously, it tricks you into, empathizing with these people to a degree.
Yeah.
Now, to Lance's point, because he shot on film, I cut my teeth shooting on video. And here's something that's a major difference about video and the way video is handled these days. When you are shooting your video, you shoot as flat as possible. You light everything to be super flat. If you want to do, like, I still have like kind of older sensibilities. I tried to light things. I didn't want to do anything so much in post. I wanted to do everything in the moment, in the frame, trying to get my lights, my highlights, my key lights, my shadows, whatever I was going for at the time. But a lot of filmmakers today, I've seen in my research as I was, teaching myself these techniques, they shot things very flat because they knew they were going to go into something like DaVinci Resolve, and they're going to start tweaking the dials, and they're going to start tweaking the contrast and tweaking the colors. They're going to be doing all this color correction, all this highlight and shadow artificially, and it's so different. It's so different. It feels artificial. Unless you're shooting everything in like, if you're doing like a George Lucas and everything around you is digital, then okay, you've got complete control of all of that. Our brains still don't recognize that as actually being there. But I've found myself lamenting the fact, and especially when I see a modern film, when Quentin Tarantino did The Hateful Eight, and he got some special lenses and some special films when he shot that, and that movie just leaps out at you. When you look at it compared to a lot of modern films, you just see the difference. There's a depth, there's a richness, there's a saturation that's just not there. And now, mind you, I am a guy who actually kind of likes to shoot on digital because I can I can work very fast with very limited resources. Like hats off to Lance, who takes the time and he has the love to keep the tradition alive. So I understand both kind of outlooks on it, but you still can't deny that the film just looks better. And especially if you're doing everything on set, what we are seeing, the camera sees, because they've taken the time to establish all this right there. And it makes a huge difference. And further on that, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it gives you more tools as well. It's like the difference between if I was going to do an oil painting, and I did an oil painting on digitally versus an oil painting with actual paint canvas, I could emulate what an oil painting looks like, but you would never get the same thing with the brush strokes and the cracking and everything else. So,
well, as you know, I'm a digital artist, and you know your point is excellently made, because there are brushes in the tools I use that are very good at mimicking that, but they will never reproduce it. Even with like directional flow and stuff like that, it's still it's still an algorithmic thing. You're not going to when people have to touch up masterpieces in museums as they slowly deteriorate. They have to learn the techniques of the masters, and all those little swirls, each little brushstroke makes a difference. Like my doing things digitally will never match anything that's done like that. Right. Now, you also brought up color, and I'm so glad you did, because and you also contrasted it against things like Beckett and Queen Elizabeth. We in America often have this idea that the Middle Ages were quite gray. Actually, they're not. They were surprisingly gaudy. Buildings were gaudy. Clothing was gaudy. There was a lot of color, to the point where, like, sometimes I've heard Brits say, like, looking back on like some castles and things that were restored, they're like, that's kind of ugly. But that was the sign. Like, I've got wealth and I've got power and I have all this color in my life. Not you little gray peasants out there. So the fact that they turn the color down on the dressings and the sets and the costuming and everything really plays into the fact that we are looking at royalty, which we often think of as glamorous, but we're seeing the seedy underbelly of royalty. And I think that was an excellent choice for them to make. It serves the story. And that's what everything on film should do, is serve the story.
Right. I absolutely agree. In fact, the one time that Henry is in royal attire, he can't wait to get that crap off.
Yeah.
And, which I think is a deliberate choice and a smart choice, because it's like Henry is done with all the fineries and the accoutrement and just wants to wield power and have a legacy, which is kind of what his motivations are. So lots of smart decisions in this film. And the more you break it down, the more you uncover, which is one of the reasons that this film, I picked it. I think it's a classic that deserves to be watched again. And I hope people go back and check it out. So with that, that's my final thought. I'm going to go around the horn. I'm going to start with Jeff and go counterclockwise. Final thoughts on Lion and Winter for everybody. What do you want to leave our audience with for Lion and Winter?
Everybody go see it. It's a brilliant film. Yeah, like if you want to see where George R.R. Martin probably got a lot of his ideas for Game of Thrones, go watch this movie. It's absolutely brilliant. It's a classic.
Yeah. And in fact, if you want to see Cersei smarter and probably sexier in her time, look at Eleanor of Aquitaine for real, because she didn't end up crushed with her brother as a lover. So we'll just leave it at that. Lance, final thoughts on The Lion in Winter.
It's cinematic history. So this is it's just not entertainment. It's a case study. It's a learning process as you're being entertained. So this should not be missed. Check it out. Great pick.
Awesome. And Steve, wrap us up. Take us home, brother. What are your final thoughts on The Lion in Winter?
It's a classic, and deservedly so. This was a movie that I really wish I had seen sooner. Like the really great ones that you kind of wish that you'd seen sooner and you hadn't before. And for a lot of the reasons that, we've been talking about. yeah, I mean, if you're somebody who's into Game of Thrones, this is going to see how George R. R. Martin's mind was shaped. I mean, if you're looking at this, to see how cinematography is done and how casting is done, and how writing is done, because the writing on this movie is witty and it's very sharp edged, and it's very, very well crafted, to a razor's edge. It is wonderfully done,
Yeah.
on all these levels, and and it wasn't like a gazillions of dollars to make this movie. This is basically well-made entertainment done at a modest budget, but you got the best out of these people that were at the top of their game at the time, and that is what you want out of a movie. It is about the drama. It is about the family dynamics and the squabbling and the politics and everything that is messed up about the human spirit invested in this one screwed up family. And where it does that, it is brilliant. Definitely see it.
Yeah, this movie was certainly no Cleopatra, another movie I'd like to get to sometime, and still the most expensive movie ever made. Dollar in, if you look at modern dollars compared to those dollars. Yeah. So I want to thank my Crusaders. This has been a great discussion. Thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad that we're going to start off, the new year just right with a classic movie, and I think we're doing that, and I'm looking forward to everything else we're going to be doing this year.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lance.
You bet. This was a great pick. I'm glad you picked it, and I'm looking forward for its spinoff. This is going to be good.
Yep. Thank you so much, Jeff.
I can't say anything more than you guys did. Great film. Everybody should go see it. Loved it, and a terrific way to start 2024.
I want to thank all of you out there for watching. Please click like on this video and subscribe to the Comic Crusaders YouTube channel for all of the various shows that we have. We've got quite a few different kinds of offerings. And make sure to check us out every Friday afternoon, or check out the replay on the Comic Crusaders channel. I will announce that our next movie is Stuntman, a movie I have not seen before.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to checking it out. Yeah. So we're going to be checking that movie out, and we're carrying Peter O'Toole forward with that movie, correct?
Yes.
Awesome. I'm a big fan of Peter O'Toole, from Lawrence of Arabia all the way forward through High Spirits, which isn't a great movie, but I love Peter O'Toole in it. So
if you haven't seen it, my favorite year with Peter O'Toole.
Yeah. So
the trick is not minding that it hurts.
Yes. So go check that out. And until the next time, make sure keep that popcorn popping, keep that popcorn warm, find a snuggable chair to get into, and keep watching movies and enjoy cinema. Until next time, we are the Cinema Crusaders, and we are out of here. Bye, everybody.
See ya.